This is Ed Buendia. This is lecture number 2 for the Qualitative Research Methods course. And what I want to discuss in this lecture is specifically how to think about defining what Marshall talks about the what of a study. And particularly I want to talk about the way that defining the what, how we distill that set of kind of the central focus of our research as it relates to one, situating the literatures in our field, as well as locating that in conversation with our lived experiences in a particular context, and how we distill particular areas of inquiry for ourselves. And equally, I want to talk about how counterarguments structure or fashion into those conversations, as well as politics, conceptual domains, and how conceptual domains, or what we might think about as theory or hypotheses, fit in this. And I think what's going to become important in just terms of understanding this is we want to walk away with a understanding of how what the relationship is between defining as well as distinguishing what is significant, or our angle, our contribution to a particular field, as well as how the design reflects that particular set of interests. So that's kind of what we're going to do in this first part. The second part of the lecture is going to plug us into a conversation that I had with Dr. Delgado Bernal, who's a professor within the College of Education's Department of Education, Culture, and Society. She's going to talk about the messiness of all this process, and one of the pieces that you're going to want to pick up in this conversation with her is there's a non-linear dimension to this that isn't necessarily captured by what we've thought about the social sciences research, or even scientific research. I don't believe even scientific research works from a very linear kind of process. In this discussion with her, there are some, well, I should say at the beginning of the lecture, there are some discussion questions which will be the key conversation points for you and your group to think through. And so what you're going to do is use those discussion questions as ways to think around her lecture, and work together. After you've had the chance to read through the materials and listen to her lecture, you'll go ahead and kind of compare notes to those. So let's go ahead and begin with discussing the way that we take the findings as well as the approaches in which our literatures have defined for us a particular area of study, what we call a line of inquiry, as well as the way we pair that with experiences. And part of what we want to think about, and what I want to discuss here, is thinking about how we read across the literature, and what we might attend to as a way of thinking about trying to distill what are the key lines of inquiry are for us, and what embedded within those key lines of inquiry, how we define the what, or the questions that we want to pursue. First of all, when we read literature, and when we read our literatures in our fields, those that interest us, there's a couple things we want to attend to. First of all, we want to attend to, one, the way that, the general questions that are being asked, how those come to constitute a line of inquiry. And line of inquiry can be just about anything, but we have different kinds of lines of inquiry. As an example, within the social foundations area, we have lines of inquiry such as the social historical processes, or even, let me become much more minute, the classroom teacher interactions and how those work to create social stratification. Or we can think about social tracking and academic tracking as part of a line of inquiry. Equally, if we're thinking about issues of cognition, we can kind of think about the social processes of literacy and literacy development as an example, the way that those come into play. But when we are reading within the literature, we're trying to track how these fields are, one, defining key questions as well as conundrums, all fields have kind of a core set of conundrums that are being defined. Equally within that, there are key theoretical constructs that are being defined. So as we think about areas such as literacy, and let me just use that as an example, the conversations within literacy kind of fork off into at least 3 or 4 different strands of kind of focal areas, with those being defined at least in terms of kind of cognitive theories of literacy development, and then you have those that are kind of a social historical framework of thinking about literacy development. And there's like I said, there's 2 or 3 others that kind of define literacy. But what becomes important in that is those readings of, or I should say those studies of literacy, help to define and work from theoretical frameworks that have a great deal of import on how studies within those areas are designed. So we're reading across those studies in terms of 1, what are the key areas that are defined, 2, the conundrums, and within those conundrums, tied to that is how particular theoretical frameworks are being defined. Let me talk a bit about those theoretical frameworks. And the idea of theoretical frameworks are become awfully important in terms of design, because theoretical frameworks essentially move us to think through units of analysis. You're going to hear me talk a great deal about units of analysis over the course of the semester. And when we think about units of analysis, a working definition of a unit of analysis would be kind of a focal area for our observation as well as our data collection. And what we're doing with a unit of analysis is we're defining kind of a core element, and it's around that element that we have all these research activities that we are asking questions around and of, as well as engaged in processes of understanding. So as we get to the McDermott article, we'll see he identifies how historically, in looking at learning disabilities, we've defined the unit of analysis as historically as the child, as learning disabilities taking place in the heads of a child. He flips that a bit, and we'll talk about that as we get to the McDermott piece. But what is important to understanding that is the way that units of analysis get defined through these theoretical pieces. So as we're reading, we want to be sophisticated readers of this literature to define, 1, the core questions as well as the theoretical frameworks. Equally, we're also trying to figure out how particular methodological, or I should say, yes, methodological realms are being defined as it pertains to the research methods being deployed for a study. This is how we begin to think about reading this literature. And I'll talk a bit here of how literature works with the FOIL, but before I move to that, let me talk about pairing or articulating reading this literature with the idea of experiences. While we're reading the literature, hopefully the type of research that you're thinking about engaging in also has some texture, or you've come to understand a particular set of social processes as it relates to social experiences. All researchers, for the most part, I would say, have an interest that is steeped in some kind of experiential realm within the social, historical, political institution that they are interested in pursuing. Social scientists generally don't find themselves thinking about particular issues without having some kind of experiences within that. And as many of you know, with having taken the 7670 course, that the idea of the objective researcher who only has this kind of intellectual investment, that framework is very limited for us as qualitative researchers. So consequently, trying to think about how we interface the bodily experiences as well as social experiences that we have as researchers to the findings that we're reading in the field becomes awfully important. It's that nexus between them that helps us define the what of the research. Let me talk now with regard to as we're thinking about defining, as we begin to think about and trying to define our domain of inquiry, as well as begin to narrow in on how we want to begin to ask a question. The how we begin to ask, or how we ask the question, is very much tied to doing some organizing or ordering of the different kinds of arguments that are being articulated around a particular domain. There are embedded within different kinds of, well, let me backtrack. They're embedded in all research are a particular set of assumptions. These are typically articulated within the theoretical framework and get articulated in the theoretical framework in defining what might be those key assumptions as they pertain to social historical relationships, social institutional relationships, or even assumptions about subjectivity. Say, what does it mean to be an agent? And so part of what you're trying to do as you begin to read across this field is identify what are those key assumptions that you find to be at play in particular ways in which research questions are being defined. And part of what you're trying to do is identify for yourself which of those seem to be persuasive to you in terms of helping you think about a particular question. Two, which of those findings as they pertain in terms of the assumptions embedded within the theoretical framework, which of those seems to be the most persuasive in terms of helping you understand those patterns that you've come to put into play. Equally, it might be the case that which of those seem to have some degree of resonance with those lived experiences that you had. And so it's that kind of ordering that you're trying to do. So this becomes important because what you are trying to do as you're thinking about defining research questions is identify which of those arguments and theoretical frameworks seems to resonate, as well as which of those might come to constitute what we define as a foil. And the idea of a foil is that you have counter arguments that seem to work from assumptions or presuppositions, starting presuppositions that just don't gel with either the politics that you are situated within or in which your study is situated, or it might be kind of the worldview, which is also connected to politics. The assumptions may not gel there. As an example of what might be assumptions that kind of set the stage and lead to design issues is many of us are familiar within social historical conversations of education, the way that the deficit discourse has functioned within educational processes. And we've seen in many research projects the way that the deficit discourse has set up a particular design approach that has created issues with framing and asking particular questions. So it becomes important as you're thinking about the different research and the different arguments that are articulated, trying to define which of those particular arguments and theoretical frameworks may sit as your foil, because you're trying to define alongside those theoretical conceptual frameworks that seem to resonate with you. You're trying to position yourself those that seem to be the frameworks as well as the ways of asking that you're not interested in asking, which is why it sits as kind of this counter argument. Equally in defining the foil and defining the assumptions, you're implicitly making choices about theory. As many of you have thought about in that 7670 course or the other social or the introduction course to a qualitative research methods course, what the field has done is it's jettisoned the idea of objective researcher. Now what we are thinking with is the situated researcher, and so consequently the idea of theory preference as a lens for thinking about how we see, how we come to understand has become the prevailing model for thinking about the limits and possibilities of the research tool, which is the qualitative researcher. So within that, as I said, those assumptions are going to shape how you're thinking about your theoretical preferences. If you're thinking that power, for example, you're interested in how teachers negotiate practices or policies such as No Child Left Behind, embedded in that idea that teachers negotiate is a particular theoretical framework as well as key assumptions about teachers as agents, as active agents who can discern, who make choices. And this is very different, say, than a Foucauldian concept of agent and subject that is kind of at the will and is a tool to discourse. So we can see how the idea of theory preference in units of analysis will change, which changes and ripples into the design of what your unit of analysis, how your unit of analysis is connected to processes of data collection and data analysis. Okay, so before we go any further, part of what hopefully you should have discerned from where we're at now is that the what needs to be put into play with a particular type of reading of the literature. Reading the literature is not just about reading for the content or the findings, right? Now we're beginning to think about the way that findings are ultimately shaped dramatically by what was asked, how it was asked, and the way that a particular set of assumptions, i.e. theoretical preferences, were put into play to find the unit of analysis. Equally, after this, you should have a clearer sense of what we mean by unit of analysis, and we'll talk about unit of analysis some more just to give it some more clarity. But by this junction, you want to make sure that you have some sense of what is a what is a unit of analysis, because we're going to be tracking units of analysis as we go on throughout this process. Okay, we are at that junction now where we're going to jump in the conversation with Dr. Delgado Bernal. There are 4 questions that you are going to use as discussion prompts for your engagement with that segment as well as with your peers. So the first question is discuss how where theory comes into play in a research project. Where, when, and how. And she's going to talk about that as it pertains to starting points and some of the complexities. So you want to try to begin to think about where that comes into play. The second is trying to get you to think about how her thinking about theory and theoretical frameworks come into play into research projects and put that into conversation with the Marshall and Rossman piece. So the second question is specifically trying to show convergences and departures from what you've heard Dr. Delgado Bernal talk about and where Marshall and Rossman have kind of talked about. Third one is embedded in her discussion of her theoretical framework. What statement might you make about the uses of theory and how theory functions in research design? So what you're trying to do here is try to create some kind of summative moment for how she's thinking about theoretical framework, and where that plays in her research design. Is it primary, secondary, tertiary? Is it how does it come into relation to the experiential as well as where she's reading and what she's reading? So you want to put some of those dimensions into play. And then the last prompt question to this discussion point is she talks about her design and the way that she engages theory. What's the principle or rule of thumb that you hear her making? Is there something that you can generate? And what I'm talking about is distill. What can you distill from what she is saying? So she doesn't necessarily give you a principle per se. She doesn't say, here's what I think you should do, but what are you discerning from what she's giving you? So that's what that 4th prompt is. And what you're going to do is take notes on these and discuss them with your peers, and you're going to turn these into me, and there's an upload on Canvas. Okay, Dolores, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. Let's start, first of all, in terms of, for people who don't know you intellectually, what is the primary research interest that you have?
I would say there's 2 research interests that are interrelated, and so part of my work is around community engaged scholarship and using different theoretical frameworks but that help me understand and look at community engaged scholarship, particularly the work I do with Adelante with Dr. Enrique Aleman. And there's different aspects of that we look at, everything from the elementary school students and their engagement in this partnership through university school mentors, looking quantitatively at retention persistent rates, but also their qualitative experiences, as well as relationships with parents, teachers, administrators, and how relationships fall into community engaged scholarship. The other line of my work would be some of the more theoretical work that I'm doing, which is using Chicana feminist theories to think about how we talk about identities, to think about how we use Chicana feminism in different educational aspects. So taking the work of Gloria Ansaldúa, Emma Perez, Sherry Moraga, some of these folks that don't come out of education, how does their work, their theoretical concepts, how are they helpful to us to think about education differently, and how have they already been used by different scholars in education to understand some kind of phenomenon in the field of education.
Yes.
So and they are related because some of that work, some of that framework informs what I'm doing in community engaged scholarship, but at times they are different also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be talking about the latter area that you talked about, which was Chicana feminism and particularly borderlands theoretical frameworks in that conversation, particularly today. Is that correct?
Well, we'll talk about the intersection of them.
Great.
So looking at community engaged scholarship via Borderlands analysis.
Phenomenal.
Yes.
So is it fair to say that the community engaged scholarship is a line of inquiry that is kind of a central theme, and then the Chicana feminism is the theoretical framework that you're harnessing to ask questions from about community engagement?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so what I would say is that my theoretical framework, my questions, and my methodology are always interconnected. However, at this point in my career, there are certain theoretical frameworks that I'm more comfortable with, or what I guess I should say is that the way I view the world is more aligned with certain types of theoretical frameworks and methodologies, and I'll bring those in to what I do. But I always start with the research questions. Again, staying with the example of community engaged scholarship, what is it specifically I want to ask about within the realm of community engaged scholarship? And it may be critical race theory is more helpful for me to answer a certain kind of question. It may be that Chicana feminism, Borderlands, is more helpful to answer other kinds of questions. So they're all interrelated.
I see. So let's start with the literatures, in terms of the types of literatures that you read and how that works to inform the research questions that become prominent in your research.
Okay, so the literature that informed a study that Dr. Enrique Aleman and I recently worked on was, the study was looking at the experiences of first-year Latino undergraduate students at a predominantly white campus. And so through the Borderlands analysis, having read and really been engulfed in this kind of Borderlands literature, we used that kind of analysis and explored how the students described, talked about, articulated their experiences participating in an ethnic studies course and in mentoring children of color, elementary school students of color. But as we did that, we were involved in collecting data, doing interviews, but at the same time, so it's very much of an iterative process for me, that it's going back and forth in the data collection as well as the literature. And as we were looking at the literature, because initially we were looking at this through a critical race theory lens. But what happened is, rather than focusing on the institutions, either the higher ed education institution of the college students or K-12 schooling of the elementary school students, we were really looking at the individuals, the college students, and how they talked about identities, how they talked about space and place that they were in their mentoring as well as in this class. And what we found was CRT wasn't necessarily helping us answer that. That literature that we're both very familiar with, it wasn't answering the kinds of questions we wanted to answer.
And if you, building on that, what was it focusing on that didn't help you get at the student experience and the identity piece?
When we were looking at CRT, what was coming out to us was how we could talk about the institutions in terms of structures that were in place that might help us understand a student's experience at a predominantly white campus. Structures meaning practices that are in place, even discourses are in place. But what we wanted to move away from was the institution and focus on how students, what we were seeing is students were talking about identities in very fluid ways. They were talking about the space of the university not as just a geographical space, a location, but as this really messy social, political, cultural space in their classroom. And for us, it didn't seem like CRT was helping us to kind of tease through that data to really understand it.
Yes.
But what happened was, as I was reading it, thought, okay, Chicana feminism, and particularly Borderlands analysis, and even more specifically some of the work of Emma Perez, began to ring through. So when I say it's iterative, part of it is like it wasn't like this was the first time I'd read this literature, right? I've been reading it for years, and Adelante is a project that's been going on for 7 years. But again, what's the actual question you're asking that we were asking in relationship to this one aspect of this bigger study? And what was ringing true to me was a concept kept coming back of, one was the decolonial imaginary that Emma Perez talks about, the other was sitio y lingua. And sitio y lingua as a concept that emerged from Emma Perez was helpful because she talks about sitio being site, a place, and lingua being a discourse, a language. And she talks about them together in where decolonizing discourses often emerge. And what we were seeing with students as they talked about their experiences was, one, we saw these kind of what we, for the purpose of the data, kind of began to say is these decolonizing discourses. They talked about these decolonizing discourses that they were exposed to in an ethnic studies course.
Yes.
And so these were, it seemed to be some of the lingua, the discourses that she was talking about. But they were also talking about these discourses in the space of the classroom, and that space not just being the physical location, but what was socially, politically happening within that classroom of peers, as well as these discourses in their site of mentoring, which is away from campus, right, in a elementary school. And so we began to think that seems something to ring through. Also, they were talking about identities. So they would talk about how they were thinking about their identity when they entered college. And through the course of the year, and we interviewed these students after they were all done with this class that had these quote-unquote decolonizing discourses. And so they would talk about their identities. They were reflecting back on how their identities were shifting, or how their identities were different in different spaces on a predominantly white campus, or when they were in a classroom of mostly young students of color. And so even the way they talked about their identities, it seemed to be helpful to come back to the borderlands analysis of having identities, fractured identities on the border. And so borders being the border of an elite, or the ivory tower, right, the institution, as well as the borders that they literally crossed going from east side, university space to west side university. There were like all these different kinds of borders, as well as the borders in the class that were among and between different racial ethnic groups, gender and things like that. So I think in terms of the engagement of literature, what was happening is it was back and forth between the data. So there were themes that emerged from the data, but when I go into research, right, I think usually we have hunches.
Right.
And so we had some hunches. It wasn't like this totally emerging, we didn't think it. We already had some hunches about, what's happening to students in this class, and anecdotally or previous data we've collected about how they talk about identities, how they talk about getting this language that allows them to use bell hooks, talk back in different spaces, whether it be at home or in other university classrooms, and the way they talked about a sense of belonging, either on campus or in the elementary school. And so those are three big themes that emerged. But how did we understand those themes so identity was a theme that emerged. How did we begin to understand it was helpful to, through a borderlands analysis. In terms of a sense of belonging, sitio y lingua became really important. And in talking back, because one, you've got this new discourse, as well as a place or an imagined community, if you will, that they were feeling they belonged or didn't belong to. And so I have to embarrassingly admit that I do total data analysis old school, so I don't use a qualitative data analysis program. So I do old school, which is once we have transcription, some kind of a narrative, going through and looking for themes that emerge or themes that are connected or counter the literature. We'll look for both. But I do what used to be, I don't know if it's still called this with data analysis program, data dumps. And so we highlight pieces that fall under talking back. That was one of our themes, talking back. So we name the file talking back, we go through mounds of interviews and data and do a data dump. We cut, paste, name it, that.
Right.
And so total old school, I don't use the data analysis program, but in doing that, then we go back through and look at that data and try to begin to understand what students are saying in relationship to, let's say, sitio y lingua, how sitio y lingua helps us understand how they talk about identities, how they talk about, again, what we were trying to explore was the experiences of these students at predominantly white campus, specifically in this undergraduate course. So how do they talk about that? And Borderlands and specifically Sitio y Lingua really helped us begin to do that.
I see. So Dolores, you had these constructs of sitio and lengua and borderlands to think about this project of how students negotiate these different spaces, and the borderlands became a theoretical framework to metaphorically as well as empirically begin to think about these different spaces. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how those got converted into theoretical frameworks that became units of analysis for interviewing or observations and other processes pertaining to data collection?
Yes, but not real smoothly, not real neatly, I should say. So it was kind of backwards, if you will, because the data collection actually took place not under a guiding theoretical framework of Borderlands. The data was actually collected with a guiding theoretical framework of critical race theory. In fact, so there was different data that we looked at. We had some focus groups, we had some individual interviews with the college students, and we actually had, I believe, for this particular aspect of the study, some written narratives.
Yeah.
And the individual interviews were very specifically under theoretical framework. In fact, that data was collected through my graduate critical race theory course. So we had paired up some of these students who'd taken the class, 20 of them, with 20 graduate students who'd learned about both the Adelante as well as the Diversity Scholars Program. So they had that kind of background. They had a CRT background. And we went in collecting these interviews with CRT as a guiding framework. And in fact, graduate students ended up using some of that data to do class papers.
I see.
But that was part of a larger study, and so we had that data with us, Dr. Aleman and myself. And when we started sifting through data, again, going back to CRT was there, but it was allowing us to look more institutionally, and we wanted to look at the messiness and making of identities and space. And so we moved away from that theoretical framework, in fact, and said, you know what? It's not really helping us answer what we want to answer. Or we're seeing some things that it's not as helpful. We probably could do it under a theoretical framework of CRT, but it doesn't seem like it's the most helpful.
Right.
And that's when we began to move away from that theoretical framework and say, so what kinds of specific concepts, or what I often call theoretical tools, help us understand this data? So I often call something like Sitio y Lingua a theoretical tool. It's the tool within a broader theory, Chicano feminist theory being, let's say, an overarching, and the theoretical tool itself being Sitio y Lingua in this case. For critical race theory, interest convergence might be one of the theoretical tools.
Yes.
And interest convergence and other tools of CRT didn't seem to help us, but something like Sitio y Lingua did. And so, if I remember correctly, and kind of thinking back through that actual data analysis process, we were already at the point of doing those data dumps that old school that I talked about, and we weren't coding by concepts. We weren't coding by, say, Sitio y Lingua.
I see.
We were coding by, we were using, I think one of them was identity. And it was just anytime they talked about identity in any kind of way, we did the data dump.
Yes.
Another one was anytime they talked about, and I forget exactly how we defined it, but our code was, I remember, talking back. And so that had to do with something in the realms of using discourses to talk back to more of a dominant narrative, a dominant discourse. And so anytime they talked about that in any kind of situation. And there might have been two others, but I remember one of them being that theme. So these later became themes, but initially they were the big coding schemes. They weren't Sitio y Lingua. Was sense of belonging. And it was a lot of stuff in there that didn't necessarily, as we broke it down later, fit. But those were kind of the three big ones that were coming out in the data. But it wasn't coded initially either with a Borderlands theoretical framework, nor specific theoretical tools from that theory.
Right.
It was once we began to see these themes of talking back, sense of belonging, and identity, that then we began to break it down and what were the theoretical tools that helped us best talk about and understand how we saw them talking about identities, or how we saw them talking about what could be called a sense of belonging. But it was, in that sense, it wasn't, and so that's why I said I can talk about it, but not real neatly, because
right.
there was one theoretical framework in place as the data got collected.
Right.
And that really was a guiding framework in terms of some of the questions that got asked in the interview protocol. And we were still able to use that data, but as we began to look at the data and the kinds of things that we were seeing and beginning to ask, that just framework wasn't as helpful.
Right.
And so that was the theoretical shift that actually happened during the process.
As on the fly.
And particularly keeping in mind that this is a more of a longitudinal, right? So some of that, the data was collected at different points in times, but over 7 years, how we think, just us as scholars, is different, but also, again, what specific questions we're asking in relationship to a larger kind of longitudinal study that can have so many aspects to it.
Right.
And so it seemed very natural to switch from the CRT that didn't fit in this particular case with the exact questions and things we're seeing, and to make them shift to Borderland.
Right. And so is it the case, because I'm thinking one of the things that students might be wondering as they're listening to this, is you get to these junctions and you realize, I have this theoretical framework, I was really invested in this theoretical framework, mobilized it into my data collection processes, and then I got through the analysis point and thought, you know what, this really doesn't help me get at what I want to get at. And why did you, it doesn't sound like it hobbled you guys as researchers, because you were still able to pick that up. Why is it that you were able to still bring meaning and find some kind of narrative within your data, and all these different codes, these constructs that you began to bring some cohesiveness around? How did what allowed that? Do you have any sense of?
That's a good question. I think for me, as one of the researchers, I'll speak that because I have, in the last few years, tended to merge different aspects of these very different theoretical frameworks, and because CRT still allowed me to kind of see these students within institutional structure, some of the guiding assumptions of critical race theory, seeing the educational structures, the educational policies and practices within a CRT framework. It wasn't a huge, in one sense it wasn't a huge shift, in another it was. It wasn't a huge shift in that I still felt that that framework was helpful for me to see kind of if I took a step backwards to kind of a macro and see what was happening, particularly with educational institutions, both higher ed and K-12. It was a big shift in the sense of some of the guiding assumptions within each framework, and when we narrowed down into the more micro of our larger project and the more micro individuals talking about identities, it just seemed natural to me to draw upon what I was has helped me in other studies in terms of Chicana feminist theory.
Right.
So I guess in saying that, it's not normally the way people move forward, right? I said that questions guide how I do work theoretically and methodologically, and there were certain questions, but that guided the initial CRT guided questions that were asked, but yet because it's a longitudinal, we had some other questions we wanted to ask. I guess one thing, Ed, would be that there was a shift. It was the same data set, but there was a shift in how we were asking different kinds of questions about it. So that data set had been used to ask some questions about higher education with a guiding CRT framework. As we began to look at it, these kind of things that we were seeing, we were using the same data set. Some of the same data set, some of it was new, like the narratives, but we were asking different questions related to that data. And so that's the switch, I guess, is that the questions then began to change, and hence we needed to adjust theoretically how we were understanding it.
Did this take place as you began to do data analysis around some of the data that you collected and decided, oh, you know what, I think there's another set of questions we can ask here that actually become much more interesting and much more important to the field? Is that what took place? Or was there something else going on that shifted the terrain? What catalyzed the shift? I guess is what I'm
I
asking.
think, if I remember correctly, that even before we got into real data analysis, I mean, you're always doing analysis, right? When you do the interview, that's one layer of analysis. When you transcribe, that's another layer as you go back and revisit the data. But before it was like real specific to data dumps and stuff like that. I think some of that was already there. There was already these hunches that, for me anyway, because I use Chicana Feminist Framework, that I think we can answer this better. And because Dr. Aliman, who his expertise is in CRT, not really Chicana feminism, I kind of brought it to him and said, you know what, we could look at it this way.
Yes.
And he said, I think I need to read some more of that. And so really it was, so at the same time I'm saying this, he's doing a lot of reading and he's saying, yeah, you know, I didn't realize it. And so, yeah, it wasn't a clear-cut process even how that happened, but I just knew in early layers of analysis, kind of that preliminary analysis, that a Chicana Feminist Framework would have something to offer us and how we could do this. And then it was kind of getting more deep hands into the data,
Right.
as well as particularly for Enrique going to the literature and really delving into that.
Right.
So they were kind of both happening, I guess.
Right. Interesting. Students, there students who were taking this course, the CRT course, most of them were students of color who were, or possibly even first-generation college students.
Yes.
So some of these themes, that in terms of approaching this project with a CRT lens initially, did it help? Let me ask this: to what degree did it help that they've had experiences within higher education institutions that may not have been the archetypical as presented in kind of romanticized versions of the higher education experience?
Yeah, or in much of the higher education literature, really. I think it was very helpful. So I've taught the CRT class doing these interviews a couple of times, and in both cases it is very often the majority of students are students of color and or first-generation college students. But the other students that are in there are often students who've had a number of ECS courses, who've thought about race and how institutions work in society and things like that. I think coming in with that and then adding the theoretical tools of CRT and the coursework was really important. I also think it for the students of color in terms of interviews, students would tell me that it made a difference. So there were some white students who said, just so you know, like I kind of think maybe they thought me as white man, like maybe they couldn't say something. I'm not sure, but this is my reading. And so I had talked to students ahead of time we were doing interviews to look at those kind of body clues. Does it seem like someone is just really forthright? Does it seem like maybe they're holding back? Or does it seem like maybe they're telling you what they think you want to hear? And I did have a couple of students who said, you know, I'm not sure, a couple of white students, white male students, there's two of them that I'm thinking of, who said, you know, I think that there was an interaction there that they maybe thought they couldn't as openly tell me stuff.
Yes.
There were also students of color who had had similar either immigration experiences or first generation kind of college experiences, who, I'm thinking of one in particular, that together they ended in tears because they had just such similar experiences and there was kind of a connection in what they talked about. So that comes into play, and yet at the same time, I think the biggest issue for either of those groups of students doing the interviews is being aware of one's different kind of positionalities and how it might or might not play out. And so that kind of awareness is important. We used all the interviews and they were all very powerful, but I really did appreciate when students said, I would ask students to talk about what was the interviewing relationship like. It's a short time period. In fact, before students did the interviews, I asked them to make contact. I suggested not just via email, so all students who were going to be interviewed agreed, I'll be interviewed, have someone contact me. So it wasn't total cold turkey, and I sent that email because all the students being interviewed knew me personally. But I told students, if you can make some kind of initial contact first, via email, via a phone call, also at the beginning of interviews, maybe to talk about yourself, particularly if you think you have any experiences like first generation college student that might be similar, or
Right.
let them know those kinds of things. But really the bottom line is how do you reflect on it afterwards, that process of how any of your positionalities may be interplayed with theirs.
At this junction, let's now talk about the task set up for the collective activity that you're going to engage in online. At this point, what you're going to do is, if you haven't read the McDermott piece, you really need to read that, because what's going to happen is this is going to be the discussion piece for the group activity that you are doing in the discussion section online. So you really need to have this. There are 5 questions that you're going to engage in as discussion points around the design piece of the McDermott piece. And these 5 questions that you're going to discuss collectively and jot down your notes and thoughts around this are, first question is what is McDermott's line of inquiry? He is locating his research in a particular field as well as a subdiscipline. Delineate what your sense of what that central line of inquiry is. 2, what is McDermott's foil or counterargument for beginning his study? He's reading across the field of his discipline, and what you need to do at this junction is identify what is that field. How is he thinking about it? What is he identified as not satisfactory for what he wants to take up? 3, what is the political and disciplinary investments, or better yet, what are the political and disciplinary investments that he's aligned with in thinking about his project? Is this about social justice? Is this about just advancing the field? Is this about impact? What do you see as both his political and disciplinary investments? And what I mean by investments are he has a particular objective in mind. What is he trying to further within the discipline that he's situated within? And secondly, is there a political element to this? If we've made the argument in the first set of readings, or actually the whole first class that you've taken in terms of thinking about paradigms and the situatedness of the researcher, the idea of political investments are always in play. And so part of what you're trying to determine within this is come to some consensus, if you can, what those political investments are. 4th, what are his units of analysis? How does he begin to stage his units of analysis for thinking about his study? He has this very kind of complex theoretical framework. Why is he, first of all, what are those elements in his theoretical framework? Secondly, how is he entwining these? And as you're looking at this entwinement, why does he need to entwine it? And the 3rd question that you want to kind of embed it in this is, does the way that he set this study up initially, does that rationalize or justify why he needs that particular theoretical framework? In other words, are you persuaded by his argument for needing to think about setting up this study conceptually using that conceptual framework? So that idea of being persuaded is central. And 5, what is the design of his research as you think about those units of analysis? He doesn't necessarily have a full blown out kind of method section just because of the way this particular piece is written, but what is he defining as data that he is collecting as well as analyzing? And so if you had to write that method section for him, what is he collecting? How is he collecting it? How is he analyzing it? And how is that, does that jive with his units of analysis as he's defined it? So those are the 5 questions that you're going to take up collectively. And what you're going to do is take notes. You're creating this kind of collective response that you can build upon. I realize that sometimes you as a group may not always agree, and that's okay. But what you're trying to do is discuss these collectively. You have groups that you are assigned to, and these are what you're going to turn into me. Thank you very much.